The air on the 80th floor of the Aura restaurant was a currency in itself, thin and precious, smelling faintly of old money, truffles, and the sterile perfume of success. It was a place where silence was the most expensive item on the menu, a golden sanctuary suspended among the clouds of New York City, far above the grit and struggle of the streets below. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling metropolis like a living work of art, each distant car a flicker of light, each building a testament to human ambition. Inside, the decor was a study in minimalist opulence. Tables of polished obsidian were spaced far apart, ensuring that the whispered conversations of power brokers and tech titans remained private, their secrets insulated by yards of empty, hallowed space. Crystal chandeliers hung from the impossibly high ceiling not as sources of light, but as frozen constellations, their refracted glow catching the silver cutlery and the rims of wine glasses, creating a universe of quiet, shimmering wealth. The soundscape was a carefully curated symphony of hushed tones, the gentle clinking of silverware against porcelain, the soft, reverent footsteps of the staff on plush carpeting, and the low, confident murmur of voices accustomed to being obeyed. This was not a place for nourishment of the body, but for the fortification of ego, a temple where deals worth more than entire nations were sealed with a polite nod and a sip of vintage Bordeaux. Every detail was designed to reinforce a single, unspoken truth. If you were here, you were not part of the world, you were above it, looking down on it with the serene detachment of a god. In the midst of this rarefied atmosphere moved Alara Vance, a ghost in a perfectly starched black uniform. To the patrons, she was less a person and more a function, an extension of the restaurant's seamless service. Her movements precise, efficient, and utterly invisible. She refilled water glasses with a practiced grace, her presence so subtle it barely registered. But beneath this veneer of professional servitude, a different world churned. Her mind, a place once filled with the intricate arguments of tort law and the dense language of corporate ethics from her time at Columbia Law, was a fortress of silent observation. She saw not just wealthy customers, but case studies. She analyzed the subtle shifts in their body language, the predatory gleam in the eyes of a CEO closing a merger, the feigned nonchalance of a wife learning of her husband's latest acquisition. A cold, steady fury was the engine that powered her through each 16-hour shift, a quiet hum beneath the surface of her polite smile. It was a fury born not of envy, but of a deep, aching injustice. She did not covet their wealth. She despised the casual cruelty with which it was so often wielded, the way it insulated them from the consequences of their actions. Consequences that people like her father had paid for in full. Her heart beat a steady, controlled rhythm, a metronome marking the time until she could finally leave this gilded cage and return to the small second-floor apartment that held everything she had left to fight for. Every clink of a champagne flute, every burst of entitled laughter sent a phantom echo through her memory, transporting her back to a world that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. In her mind's eye, she saw her father, David Vance, not as the frail man who now struggled to form words, but as he was before, a brilliant chemical engineer with a booming laugh and eyes that sparkled with intellectual curiosity. He would stand in their small kitchen, sketching complex molecular structures on a napkin, trying to explain to a young Alara how he was developing a process that could save lives. He was a man who believed in the inherent goodness of his work, a man who believed that corporations, for all their power, still had a soul. That belief had been his undoing. The memory then shifted, the warm kitchen dissolving into the sterile white of a hospital room, the scent of her father's coffee replaced by the sharp, antiseptic smell of despair. She remembered the day his name was dragged through the mud, the headlines screaming his negligence in the catastrophic chemical spill at Sterling Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. He had been the scapegoat, the convenient shield for a board of directors who had cut safety protocols to protect their stock price. He had been a whistleblower silenced not with a threat, but with public ruin. The legal battle had consumed their savings. The shame had shattered his spirit, and the stress had triggered the debilitating stroke that left him a prisoner in his own body. Ilera had dropped out of Columbia law, her own brilliant future sacrificed at the altar of his medical bills, her fight for justice in the courtroom replaced by a daily battle for his dignity. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience. As we get started, drop your city or country in the comments, and if you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it, so you're always here for stories like this. The heavy glass doors of Aura swung open, and a frigid gust of winter air sliced through the carefully climate-controlled room, carrying with it a presence that was utterly alien to this environment. An old man stood hesitatingly at the entrance, a frail figure silhouetted against the glittering city lights. He wore a threadbare coat, thin and worn at the elbows, a garment that offered little protection against the biting wind. His shoulders were hunched, and he shivered, a tremor that seemed to rack his entire body. His face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with deep lines, and his eyes, though clouded with what looked like confusion, held a flicker of something else, a sharp, penetrating intelligence that was jarringly out of place. He was the physical embodiment of the world Aura was designed to exclude. The host, a young man with a perfectly sculpted sneer, looked him up and down with open disgust, his posture stiffening as if to physically ward off the man's poverty. Other waiters averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in polishing already gleaming silverware. But beneath the tattered clothes and the convincing performance of destitution, a cold, cynical mind was at work. Arthur Sterling, the reclusive billionaire CEO of Sterling Vanguard, was conducting one of his cruel little experiments, a test to confirm his deeply held belief that kindness was a myth, a performance reserved only for those who had something to offer. He was a predator in sheep's clothing, hunting for the very last vestiges of human decency, hoping to prove it extinct. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant manager, materialized from the shadows like a shark sensing blood in the water. He was a man whose entire being was calibrated to the frequency of wealth, his movements slick and obsequious in the presence of his patrons, but brutally sharp toward his staff. He glided across the floor, his face a mask of controlled fury, his eyes fixed on the unwelcome old man. He didn't see a person in need, he saw a contamination, a stain on the pristine canvas of his domain. His voice, when he spoke to the host, was a low, venomous hiss, meant to be overheard. He gestured dismissively with a flick of his wrist, a gesture that wrote off the old man's entire existence as an inconvenience. He commanded the host to call security, his words dripping with contempt for the man's poverty, treating his presence not as a mistake, but as an act of aggression against the restaurant's very brand. For Dubois, a person's worth was directly correlated with their net worth, and this man, in his threadbare coat, registered as a zero. He was an error in the system, a piece of trash that had blown in from the street, and it was his job to dispose of it as quickly and efficiently as possible, restoring the flawless, moneyed perfection of Aura, before any of the important clientele were made to feel uncomfortable by the raw, unfiltered sight of human suffering. While others turned away, Ilera felt an instinctive pull, a quiet but powerful hum of recognition. She saw past the worn clothes and the shivering frame. In the old man's vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her father. She saw the same tremor in his hands that her father had after the stroke, the same lost look in his eyes that she saw whenever he struggled to find a word that was once so easy. For her, this wasn't an intrusion. It was a human being cold and alone in a room full of people who had forgotten how to see. Ignoring the palpable wave of disapproval from Mr. Dubois and the scornful glances from her colleagues, she moved toward him. Her steps were deliberate, her expression calm and professional, betraying none of the quiet rebellion brewing within her. She didn't offer pity, which she knew could feel like another form of judgment. Instead, she offered a simple, profound gesture of dignity. She gently placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady, and guided him away from the cold judgment of the entrance to a small, secluded table in a quiet corner, a table usually reserved for staff breaks. It was a small act, almost imperceptible in the grand theater of the restaurant, but in the world of Aura, it was a declaration of war against the unwritten rules of wealth and power, an act of defiant compassion in a temple built to worship indifference. The moment Mr. Dubois saw her act of kindness, his composure shattered. The carefully constructed mask of the sophisticated restaurateur fell away, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. He strode over to their table, his polished shoes clicking aggressively on the marble floor, each step an announcement of his impending wrath. He stopped directly in front of Ilara, positioning himself so that the wealthy patrons at the nearby tables could bear witness to his authority. His voice, no longer a hiss, boomed through the hushed dining room, sharp and cruel. He called her insolent, his words lashing out like a whip. He accused her of staining the restaurant's brand, of turning a temple of class into a common shelter. The humiliation was intensely public, designed to strip her of her dignity and make an example of her. As he spoke, his face contorted with a sneering rage. The wealthy patrons watched with a mixture of detached amusement and mild discomfort. But Ilara did not hear his words as an attack on her job. She heard them as an echo of the same corporate arrogance that had destroyed her father. In her mind, Dubois' face blurred, replaced by the smug expressions of the sterling vanguard executives on the news, denying any wrongdoing. A cold fury, clean and hard as diamond, solidified in her veins. Her hands, which had been setting down a glass of water for the old man, became perfectly still. Her breathing slowed, becoming deep and controlled. He was insulting her kindness, the very quality her father had been punished for, the quality her mother had lived by. In that moment of public degradation, as Mr. Dubois continued his tirade, something deep within Ilara's memory stirred. It was a story her mother, Eleanor Vance, used to tell her on rainy afternoons. A story from her time as a private nurse for the children of the city's most powerful families. It was a bittersweet memory of a time before their world had crumbled. A story of one particular patient, a small, sickly boy who lived in a vast, empty mansion, lonely and afraid. Her mother was the only one who could make him smile, the only one who saw the flicker of a strong spirit inside his frail body. She had given him a secret nickname, a name known only to the two of them, a term of endearment and encouragement. The name was a ghost, a relic from a forgotten past, a symbol of the unconditional kindness her mother had shown to a sad little boy who would one day grow up to inherit an empire. As Mr. Dubois spat his final, venomous order to get the old man out, the memory crystallized in Ilara's mind with perfect, stunning clarity. A plan, not of revenge, but of a justice so poetic it felt like fate, began to form. She looked from the manager's enraged face to the disguised billionaire sitting at the table, and a quiet, unshakable resolve settled over her. She would not just defy the order. She would shatter the world of the man sitting right in front of her, using a single forgotten word from a lifetime ago. The manager's final venomous order hung in the air, a command designed to sever the last thread of Ilara's compassion and force her back into the role of an invisible servant. But his words did not find their intended target. They passed through her, failing to touch the core of resolve that had just been forged in the crucible of her memory. She looked at the shivering old man, and the image of her father, trapped in the wreckage of his own body, superimposed itself upon him. She saw the tremor in his hands, the lost look in his eyes, and a wave of protective fury washed over her, so cold and so pure it felt like clarity. To obey Dubois would be a betrayal not just of this stranger, but of her father, of her mother's memory, of the very principle of human decency that the world of Aura was built to mock. In that suspended moment, a choice was made, not in her mind, but in her soul. She would not just defy the order. She would answer cruelty with a gesture so profoundly kind, so personally resonant, that it would echo with the force of a judgment. She would offer a small warmth in a world of cold indifference, an act that was both a tribute and a weapon. With a calmness that unnerved even herself, Alara turned away from the fuming manager and the disguised billionaire. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace toward the service station, her movements as graceful and practiced as they had been all night. But now they were imbued with a new purpose. The other waiters watched her, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity, whispering amongst themselves about her blatant insubordination. She ignored them, her focus narrowed to a single point. She reached the gleaming chrome espresso machine, a high-tech altar that dispensed $1,000 coffee portfolios to the restaurant's clientele. She bypassed it, moving instead to the simple coffee pot used by the staff. She took a clean, heavy ceramic mug, the kind reserved for the kitchen crew, feeling its solid weight in her hand. She poured the dark, fragrant liquid, the steam rising to mist her face. Then she did something unthinkable in this establishment. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulling out her own worn leather wallet, and placed $3 of her own money into the register, meticulously accounting for the cost of the coffee. It was her offering, a small, personal sacrifice that transformed the act from service into a gift. Her return journey to the table felt like a walk through a different dimension. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the soft clinking of cutlery, and the low murmur of conversations seemed to fade into a distant hum. All she could hear was the frantic, angry beating of her own heart, a drumbeat of rebellion against a world that had taken so much from her. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her back. The patrons, curious gazes, her colleagues, fearful stares, and most of all, the searing heat of Mr. Dubois' murderous glare. He stood frozen by the table, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief, waiting for her to complete her suicidal act of defiance. Yet in her mind, she was not in Aura anymore. She was walking down a sterile hospital corridor, carrying a warm blanket for her father. She was walking into a courtroom, her briefcase filled with evidence that would never be heard. This short walk across the plush carpet became the culmination of a decade of suppressed rage, of silent grief, of a fight for justice she had been forced to abandon. She was no longer just a waitress. She was David Vance's daughter, and she was done being invisible. She reached the table, a small island of quiet tension in the vast, opulent room. The old man looked up at her, his eyes filled with a weary confusion that seemed, for a moment, entirely genuine. Mr. Dubois took a sharp breath, preparing to unleash a fresh torrent of fury. But Alara gave him no opportunity. With an economy of movement that was both elegant and final, she leaned forward, her focus entirely on the man before her. She gently placed the warm mug on the polished obsidian tabletop. The soft clink of the ceramic against the stone was the only sound in their immediate vicinity, a small, definitive punctuation mark in the silent standoff. The rich aroma of the coffee rose between them, a humble, comforting scent entirely at odds with the expensive perfumes and truffle oil that saturated the air of Aura. For a fraction of a second, she allowed her professional mask to slip, and in her eyes there was not pity but a profound and weary empathy, a shared understanding of what it felt like to be cold and overlooked in a world of glittering, heartless abundance. The gesture was complete, an act of simple, unadorned kindness that stood in stark defiance of the room's unwritten laws. Then she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper, but it was low, intended only for him, a private correspondence in a public space. It was the voice her mother used to use when telling bedtime stories, a tone imbued with a secret, conspiratorial warmth. She leaned in just a fraction closer, as if sharing a confidence that the rest of the world was not worthy of hearing. The words that came out were not from Alara the waitress, but from Eleanor Vance's daughter, a conduit for a memory so old and so personal it felt like a sacred text. She looked directly into the old man's eyes, seeing past the convincing facade of destitution to the lonely child her mother had once described. "It's cold out there," she said softly, her voice a balm against the room's frigid judgment. Everyone deserves a little warmth, little sparrow. The name left her lips and hung in the air between them. A fragile, impossible thing, a ghost of a word from a lifetime ago, a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for over 60 years. It was a name that had no business being spoken in this place, at this time, by this person. For Arthur Sterling, the world did not just stop, it fractured. The name, Little Sparrow, did not register as a sound but as a physical impact, a seismic shockwave that traveled from his ears directly to the core of his being, bypassing all rational thought. His hand, which had been resting on the table, began to tremble uncontrollably. A violent tremor that rattled the heavy coffee cup in its saucer, the clattering sound echoing in the sudden profound silence of his mind. The carefully constructed persona of the frail, destitute old man evaporated in an instant, burned away by the sheer, stunning impossibility of what he had just heard. That name was not a name. It was a relic, an artifact from a buried civilization of his own life, a piece of his soul he thought had been lost forever. It belonged to a world of shadowy sick rooms, of feverish nights and lonely days in a mansion that felt more like a museum, a world where the only light had been the gentle smile of a young nurse who saw not a frail heir but a small, determined boy. A torrent of forgotten sensations flooded him, overwhelming the sterile opulence of the restaurant. He could smell the faint, clean scent of his mother's rosewater perfume, a scent she always wore. He could feel the cool, gentle pressure of her hand on his feverish forehead, a touch that promised safety and unconditional love. He could hear her voice, a soft melody in the cavernous silence of his childhood, whispering stories of courage and strength, calling him her little sparrow because he was so small and fragile, yet she insisted his spirit was destined to fly. This waitress, this complete stranger, had somehow reached into the deepest, most protected vault of his memory and pulled out the one treasure he thought was his alone. His cruel, cynical test, the entire purpose of this humiliating charade, was not just ruined, it was annihilated, exposed as the pathetic, childish game it was. He had come here seeking to confirm the world's ugliness, and had instead stumbled upon a miracle, a ghost, a judgment. The carefully constructed walls of his cynicism, built over a lifetime of ruthless deals and profound isolation, crumbled into dust. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto Alara's. The roomy, unfocused gaze of the old man was gone, replaced by the sharp, penetrating stare of a billionaire in the throes of utter shock. He no longer saw a waitress in a black uniform. He saw a messenger, an oracle, a figure who had somehow transcended the known laws of his universe. Who was she? How could she possibly know that name? The question hammered against the inside of his skull with a physical force. For the first time in decades, Arthur Sterling felt a feeling he had long ago dismissed as a weakness: awe. He was in the presence of something inexplicable, a connection to his past so profound and so impossible that it felt like the hand of fate itself had reached down into this ridiculous restaurant and pointed a finger directly at him. His entire life, a carefully curated narrative of power and control, had just been completely and irrevocably upended by a single whispered phrase from a woman he was supposed to believe was insignificant. Mr. Dubois, however, was blind to the cataclysm that had just occurred. He saw only the final, unforgivable act of insubordination. He had witnessed Alara not only serve the man but lean in and whisper to him, an act of intimacy that was a flagrant violation of professional distance. The billionaire's trembling hand and the rattling cup registered only as a sign of the old man's decrepitude, further proof of his unsuitability for this establishment. The manager's face, already flushed with anger, darkened to a deep, apoplectic purple. The delicate web of his authority had been torn, and his only recourse was to reassert it with overwhelming, brutal force. He was no longer just a manager enforcing rules. He was a petty king whose decree had been openly mocked, and the only answer to such treason was a swift and public execution. He would not just fire her, he would humiliate her, exorcise her from this sacred space, and restore the natural order of things where the powerful were comfortable and the poor were invisible. With a guttural snarl of pure rage, Mr. Dubois lunged forward, his movements no longer slick and controlled, but jagged and furious. "Insolent girl!" he roared, his voice cracking the reverent silence of the dining room and causing heads to turn at every table. The carefully cultivated ambiance of Aura shattered, replaced by the raw, ugly theater of a public dressing down. "You are a disgrace to this establishment! You are fired!" The words were not just a termination of employment. They were a curse, an expulsion from the gilded world he lorded over. But words were not enough to satisfy his rage. He reached out and grabbed Alara's upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with a surprising, vicious strength. His intention was clear: to physically drag her from the restaurant, to make a spectacle of her removal, to demonstrate to all the patrons and staff the severe consequences of misplaced compassion. He was making an example of her, reaffirming the cold, hard currency of this world: obedience. The patrons, who had been watching the unfolding drama with a detached, almost theatrical interest, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The line between entertainment and genuine ugliness had been crossed. This was no longer a minor disturbance. It was a raw display of power and cruelty that intruded upon their carefully curated evening. The sight of the manager physically accosting the young waitress was too real, too base for a place like Aura. A few people exchanged concerned glances, while others looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their lobster bisque, wishing to be anywhere else. But no one intervened. They were spectators in this temple of wealth, and the drama between the servants was not their concern. They were insulated from it by their fortunes, by the very height of the building that separated them from the messy, unpredictable world below. Alara, for her part, did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, her body absorbing the manager's assault without yielding, her eyes fixed on the man sitting at the table, the man whose world had just been broken open. In that instant, as Dubois' fingers tightened on Alara's arm, the last vestiges of the frail old man vanished from Arthur Sterling's being. The sight of this pompous, preening martinet laying a hand on the woman who had just resurrected his mother's ghost ignited a cold, primeval fury within him. It was a fury he had not felt in years, the deep, volcanic anger of a king who witnesses a barbarian desecrating a holy site. The confusion and awe that had momentarily paralyzed him were instantly replaced by an absolute, diamond-hard certainty. He had come here to test the world, and in doing so, he had stumbled upon a sacred mystery. This manager, in his brutish ignorance, was trying to extinguish it. With a will forged from a lifetime of command, Arthur Sterling reclaimed his body and his voice, not as a disguised billionaire, but as the apex predator of this entire ecosystem. The change was not just psychological, it was physical, a transformation that seemed to warp the very air around him. He said one word. It was not shouted, but it cut through the manager's tirade with the force of a thunderclap. "Stop!" The word was a monolith of sound, impossibly deep and resonant, emanating from the chest of a man who looked as though he could be felled by a strong gust of wind. It was a voice that had chaired 1,000-person board meetings, a voice that had brought CEOs to their knees, a voice that had moved markets and toppled corporate dynasties. It was a voice utterly saturated with a lifetime of unquestioned, absolute authority. It held no anger, no panic, only the calm, unshakable certainty of a man who had never in his adult life had an order questioned. The command was so pure, so potent, that it seemed to bypass the ears and act directly on the central nervous system. It was the sound of power in its most elemental form, and it froze Mr. Dubois in his tracks as effectively as if he had been encased in ice. Mr. Dubois' hand fell from Alara's arm as if it had been struck by lightning. He stood, mouth agape, his tirade cut off mid-sentence. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the pathetic old man with the sound he had just heard. It was a cognitive dissonance so profound that it left him momentarily speechless, his brain a cascade of error messages. He stared at the man at the table, who was now undergoing a startling metamorphosis. The hunched, shivering shoulders were straightening, rising to their full, broad width. The head, which had been bowed in meekness, was now held high, revealing a jawline that was hard and aristocratic. The clouded, confused eyes had cleared and now burned with an intelligence so cold and so sharp it was terrifying. The threadbare coat and the stooped posture were just a costume, and the actor within was now taking his bow, shedding the role of a beggar to reveal the king beneath. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. The patrons, the staff, everyone felt the seismic shift in the room's power dynamic. The quiet murmurings ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that was thick with tension and awe. They were witnessing something extraordinary, the kind of raw, unfiltered display of power that usually happens behind the closed doors of boardrooms, not over dessert menus. They didn't know who this old man was, but they knew, with an instinctual certainty, that he was someone of immense importance. He was the center of gravity around which the entire room now orbited. Mr. Dubois, who moments before had been the absolute authority in this domain, now seemed small and insignificant, a court jester who had foolishly insulted the king himself. His face, once purple with rage, was now pale with a dawning, sickening fear. He had made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake, and he was only just beginning to understand its magnitude. Arthur Sterling ignored the paralyzed manager as if he were a piece of furniture. His entire focus, his entire world had narrowed to the woman standing before him. He rose slowly from his chair, his body unfolding with a surprising grace, until he was standing at his full, imposing height. He was no longer a shivering old man. He was a titan of industry, a man accustomed to looking down on the world from a great height. But as he looked at Ilara, his expression was not one of command or arrogance. It was one of raw, desperate inquiry. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost its commanding edge, replaced by a tone of hushed, reverent confusion, a voice grappling with the impossible. "That name," he said, his words barely more than a breath, but they carried across the silent room. "Only one person in the world ever called me that. A nurse, a long time ago. Her name was Eleanor Vance." He spoke the name as if it were a prayer, a memory he was pulling from the deepest part of his soul, offering it to her as both a question and a plea. The air crackled with the unspoken history connecting these two strangers. Ilara met his gaze without flinching, her own expression a complex mask of grief and steel. The memory of her mother, which had been a source of quiet strength, now became a weapon of truth. The kindness she had inherited was now paired with the sharp, analytical mind she had honed at Columbia Law. She saw the dawning comprehension in his eyes, the desperate search for an explanation, and she knew that the moment of revelation was at hand. She would not let him control this narrative. This was her story, her family's pain, and she would be the one to tell it. A decade of sorrow had been compressed into a single point of confrontation, and she felt the weight of her father's shattered life and her mother's memory resting on her shoulders. She would not falter now. This was the moment she had unknowingly been preparing for her entire life. Her voice, when she finally answered, was as calm and as clear as a winter morning. There was no tremor of fear or anger, only the profound, unshakable weight of truth. "She was my mother," Ilara stated, the simple words landing with the force of a verdict. The statement was an answer, but it was also a claim, a declaration of lineage that connected her directly to the billionaire's most cherished memory. She let the words settle in the silent room, allowing him to absorb their full, staggering implication. The waitress who had shown him a moment of pure, uncalculated kindness was the daughter of the woman who had defined kindness for him. The cosmic coincidence was almost too much to bear, a twist of fate so perfect, so poetic, that it felt like the universe itself was demanding a reckoning. But Ilara knew this was not the end of the story. It was merely the opening chapter. Arthur stared at her, his mind reeling. Eleanor Vance's daughter. The kind, gentle woman who had nursed him through childhood illnesses, who had told him stories and made him smile when no one else could, had a daughter. And that daughter was standing right here, in a waitress uniform, in a restaurant he frequented, having just performed an act of kindness so pure it mirrored her mother's perfectly. He searched her face, looking for a trace of Eleanor's features, a shadow of her smile, in the determined set of Ilara's jaw. He saw it, not in her physical appearance, but in the quiet dignity of her bearing, in the defiant compassion that had led her to this very moment. But before he could fully process this miracle, before he could even begin to articulate the 1,000 questions swirling in his mind, Ilara delivered the final, devastating blow, the one that would unravel his entire world. She held his gaze, her eyes turning from empathetic to hard as flint. The time for shared memory was over. Now came the time for judgment. She took a deliberate breath, and with a voice that was suddenly low, precise, and laced with the ice of a 10-year-old wound, she added the final piece of the puzzle. "She was my mother," Ilara repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "And my father was David Vance." She paused, letting the name hang in the air between them. A name that was a curse in the halls of his corporation, a name synonymous with ruin and scandal. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into his, her final words a dagger aimed directly at his conscience. "A name your family," she said, her voice dripping with the restrained fury of a lifetime, "should remember." The name hit Arthur Sterling with the force of a physical assault. David Vance, the scapegoat, the whistleblower. The chemical engineer his father had publicly crucified to cover up Sterling Vanguard's criminal negligence in the Havenwood chemical spill a decade ago. The man whose life and reputation his family had systematically dismantled to protect their stock price during a merger. The name was not just a memory, it was the foundational sin upon which the modern Sterling Vanguard empire was built. It was a ghost that haunted the company's past, a dark secret buried under years of legal maneuvering and public relations spin. And now, that ghost had a daughter, and she was standing right in front of him, having just shown him a moment of grace so profound it had brought him to his knees. The test was over. The judgment had begun. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over Arthur. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. This was not a coincidence. This was not fate. This was a reckoning. His arrogant, cynical little test to prove the absence of kindness in the world had led him directly to the one person on earth who had paid the highest price for his family's cruelty. He had walked into his own trial, and his judge was a waitress holding a cup of coffee. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and he no longer saw the daughter of a kind nurse or the face of an impossible coincidence. He saw the living embodiment of his family's guilt, the human cost of his inherited empire. The entire gilded structure of his life, built on a foundation of lies and forgotten victims, began to tremble, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was about to come crashing down. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the impending explosion. Mr. Dubois stood forgotten, a statue of impotent fear. The wealthy patrons were no longer diners. They were the jury, witnesses to a confrontation that transcended a simple workplace dispute and had become a trial for a man's soul. Ilara stood her ground, her posture unwavering, her gaze locked on Arthur. She had just detonated a bomb in the middle of his life, and she waited for the fallout, her heart hammering against her ribs not with fear, but with the terrible, exhilarating thrill of a justice long delayed. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely and utterly inverted. The billionaire was the one who was trapped, exposed, and vulnerable. The invisible waitress, armed with nothing but the truth of her family's name, held all the power in the world. Arthur felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The opulent restaurant, the shocked faces, the city lights twinkling below, it all dissolved into a blur of meaningless detail. His mind was a maelstrom of guilt, shame, and a dawning, terrifying horror. The story of David Vance was one he had willfully ignored, a piece of family history he had been taught to dismiss as a necessary, albeit unpleasant, cost of doing business. He had been a young executive at the time, complicit in his silence, content to let his father handle the messy details. He had never once considered the man, David Vance, as a person with a family, with a daughter. Now, that daughter stood before him, her eyes a mirror reflecting his own inherited sins. His simple, cruel experiment had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable, unearthing a truth he had spent his life avoiding. He was not just a cynical billionaire. He was the heir to a kingdom built on the ruins of her life. Ilara watched the cascade of emotions play across his face, the shock, the denial, the dawning horror, and finally, the crushing weight of recognition. For the first time in 10 years, she felt a flicker of something other than grief or rage. It was a sense of profound, terrifying power. She had spoken the truth, and it had been enough to bring a titan to his knees. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt that it was a fight she could win. The waitress uniform felt less like a costume of servitude and more like armor. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but an agent of a justice that had been sleeping for a decade. She had found her voice in the most unlikely of places, and she would not be silenced again. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the quiet war for David Vance's legacy had just begun. The aftermath in the restaurant was not a return to normalcy, but a descent into a new, surreal kind of silence. The ambient clinking of silverware had ceased. The hushed conversations had died on the patrons' lips, and the entire 80th floor seemed to be holding its breath, suspended in the gravity of the revelation. Mr. Dubois, once the room's strutting commander, was now a statue of pure, unadulterated terror, his face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. He stood frozen, a forgotten puppet whose strings had been cut, his mind utterly incapable of processing the quantum leap in power that had just occurred before his very eyes. The old beggar was Arthur Sterling, and the insolent waitress was the daughter of the man his empire had crushed. It was a truth too vast, too catastrophic for the narrow confines of his world. The patrons, a collection of the city's most influential figures, were no longer diners enjoying a spectacle. They were a captive audience, a jury that had been inadvertently impaneled to witness a trial that had been a decade in the making. They watched, their expressions a mixture of awe and morbid fascination, understanding with a primal instinct that they were seeing the kind of raw, foundational power that truly ran the world, stripped bare of its corporate niceties and laid out on the obsidian tabletop. Arthur Sterling felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, the solid ground of his life having crumbled away into a chasm of his family's making. The name, David Vance, echoed in the chambers of his memory, unlocking doors he had kept sealed for years. He saw his own father, a man of granite and cold calculation, speaking the name with a dismissive wave of his hand, calling him a necessary casualty in the war for market dominance. At the time, Arthur had accepted it, his ambition and filial loyalty blinding him to the human cost. Now that cost stood before him, embodied in the unwavering gaze of this young woman, her eyes holding the weight of a ruined family. His first instinct, the one that had been drilled into him since birth, was to control the damage, to solve the problem with the one tool he truly understood: money. He imagined writing a check, a number with so many zeros it would be obscene, enough to silence any ghost. He could buy her a new life, fund her father's care for a century, erase the past with a tidal wave of wealth. It was a clean, simple, corporate solution to a messy, human problem. It was the Sterling way. But when he looked at Ilara, he saw that this solution was not just inadequate, it was a profound insult. He saw in her stance not a hint of weakness, not a flicker of greed, but an unshakable resolve that money could not touch. She stood there, a solitary pillar of defiance in his gilded world, and he knew that offering her wealth would be like trying to bribe a force of nature. It would be a confirmation of everything she already believed about his family, that they thought every person had a price, that justice could be purchased like a commodity. The realization left him feeling hollow and powerless in a way he had never experienced. He, a man who could move global markets with a single phone call, had no currency that could settle this debt. He was stripped of his armor, left with nothing but the naked, ugly truth of his legacy. The cynical test he had designed to expose the world's greed had instead exposed the utter bankruptcy of his own soul, and he was left standing in the wreckage, with no idea how to begin to rebuild. Ilara left Aura that night not with a sense of triumph, but with the heavy, cold clarity of a soldier after the first shot of a long war has been fired. The adrenaline of the confrontation receded, leaving behind the stark reality of her situation. She was unemployed, her meager savings barely enough to cover the next month's rent and her father's complex medications. The path ahead was a dark, unmapped territory, filled with the ghosts of a legal system she had once revered, and the colossal shadow of the Sterling Vanguard Empire. She walked through the cold, indifferent streets of New York, the city lights blurring through the tears she refused to let fall. Her father's face swam in her mind, his gentle eyes, the slight, crooked smile he could still manage on good days. This fight was for him, for the name that had been stolen from him, for the dignity that was the only thing they had left. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Her law school knowledge was a decade old, a rusted weapon against a modern corporate leviathan. She needed a guide, a strategist, someone who understood the battlefield. Her mind settled on one name, a beacon from her past, Professor Alistair Finch. The next morning, she found herself standing before the hallowed, ivy-covered gates of Columbia University, a place that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The air smelled of old paper and new ideas, a scent that stirred a deep, painful nostalgia within her. Professor Finch's office was exactly as she remembered it, a chaotic sanctuary of towering book stacks, cluttered desks, and the faint aroma of pipe tobacco and strong tea. Finch himself was a man who seemed to be carved from the same oak as his bookshelves, with a sharp, inquisitive mind and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to her story without interruption, his expression shifting from surprise to a deep, simmering anger as she recounted the events at the restaurant and the decade of injustice that preceded it. When she finished, he didn't offer condolences or platitudes. He leaned back in his worn leather chair, the springs groaning in protest, and looked at her with a fierce, burning pride. He saw not a defeated waitress, but the brilliant, tenacious student he had once mentored, the legal mind he had believed was destined for greatness. He saw the fire that had been banked for 10 years, now roaring back to life. "They didn't just ruin your father, Ilara," Professor Finch said, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "They attacked the very principle of corporate accountability. They made an example of a good man to protect their profits. This isn't just about revenge. This is about restoration." His words were a balm to her wounded spirit, transforming her personal vendetta into a noble crusade. For hours they worked, the old professor and his prodigal student, their minds igniting in a shared passion for justice. They spread out the contents of the worn cardboard box she had kept under her bed for 10 years. Her father's old research notes, copies of his internal warnings, the rejection letters from regulatory agencies. It was the ghost of a case, a collection of truths that had been dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee. Finch, with his decades of experience, saw the framework of a powerful argument, but he also saw the gaping holes. "This is the why," he said, tapping a yellowed memo. "But we need the how. We need to prove a conscious, deliberate conspiracy to silence him, and we need to link it directly to the current board. We need a voice from inside the machine." The hunt began not in the streets, but in the digital ether. Ilara, working from a dusty carrel in the Columbia Law Library that Finch had arranged for her, dove back into the world she had left behind. The intricate dance of corporate law, the dense language of SEC filings, the subtle art of forensic accounting, It all came flooding back, not as academic theory, but as a set of practical weapons. She spent days buried in shareholder reports, press archives, and employee databases, cross-referencing names from her father's old emails with the current Sterling Vanguard hierarchy. She was searching for a weak link, a person who was there during the initial cover-up and who might still harbor a shred of conscience, or at the very least, a grudge. Her search narrowed to one name: Marcus Thorne. He had been a junior analyst in the risk management department 10 years ago. His name appeared on the distribution list of several of her father's initial safety warnings. His career since had been one of lateral moves and stalled promotions, a clear sign of someone who had been quietly sidelined. He was a man who likely knew too much to be fired, but not enough to be promoted. He was a ghost in the corporate machine, a perfect potential ally. Finding Marcus Thorne was easy. Approaching him was a delicate, dangerous operation. He was a man who had survived for a decade by being invisible, by keeping his head down. A direct confrontation would send him running. Ilara spent a week observing his routine, learning the coffee shop he visited every morning before work, the park bench where he ate his sad desk lunch. She chose her moment carefully, approaching him not as a threat, but as a fellow traveler in the land of forgotten truths. She sat down at his table at the coffee shop, placing a single, faded document on the table between them. It was a copy of an internal memo he had co-signed 10 years ago, acknowledging receipt of her father's final, desperate warning about the faulty chemical seals. His face went ashen, the color draining away until his skin was the color of old parchment. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a fear that had been his constant companion for a decade. He tried to stand, to flee, but Ilara's voice, low and steady, rooted him to the spot. "I'm not here to cause you trouble, Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice a carefully calibrated mixture of empathy and steel. "I'm here because I think we were both left behind by the same people. My father, David Vance, tried to prevent a disaster. You tried to log his warning. And for that, his life was destroyed, and your career was put in a cage." She didn't accuse him, she allied with him. She spoke of the moral injury he must have carried, the weight of his complicity. She painted a picture of a shared enemy, of a justice that could still be won. She saw the flicker of conflict in his eyes, the war between his ingrained fear and his buried integrity. He had a family, a mortgage, a life built on the shaky foundation of his silence. But he also had a conscience, one that had been slowly eroding him from the inside out for 10 long years. She was offering him a chance, not just to help her, but to save himself. Marcus Thorne did not agree immediately. He left the coffee shop in a panicked rush, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. For 3 agonizing days, Ilara heard nothing. She was plunged into a state of doubt, fearing she had miscalculated, that she had pushed too hard and scared away her only potential link to the truth. She replayed their conversation in her mind 1,000 times, questioning every word, every nuance. The weight of her father's hope, a hope she had just rekindled, felt impossibly heavy. The entire crusade rested on the conscience of one frightened man. During those days of silence, she visited her father, sitting by his bedside, reading to him from his old engineering textbooks. She watched the slow, laborious effort it took for him to simply raise a glass of water, a stark reminder of the physical cost of Sterling Vanguard's lies. The sight steeled her resolve. If Marcus said no, she would find another way. She would never give up. The fight had just begun. On the 4th morning, a plain, unmarked envelope appeared under her apartment door. There was no note, no explanation. Inside was a single USB drive. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she plugged it into her laptop, her hands slick with a mixture of hope and fear. The drive contained not a confession, but a key. It held a series of low-level access credentials and a complex map of Sterling Vanguard's internal servers, specifically highlighting the location of their deep archival storage, the digital graveyard, where old, supposedly irrelevant data was left to rot. It was a map to the company's subconscious, a labyrinth of forgotten files and deleted histories. Marcus had not given her the smoking gun, but he had given her the location of the armory and a key to the door. It was a profound act of courage, a quiet rebellion from a man who had chosen to break his silence, and it was everything Ilara needed to begin her descent into the belly of the beast. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled obsession. Ilara, working from the borrowed law library Carol, transformed into a digital archaeologist, painstakingly excavating the ruins of Sterling Vanguard's past. She waded through terabytes of data, a digital ocean of mundane corporate communications, quarterly reports, and interoffice memos. It was a soul-crushing, needle-in-a-haystack search. She faced encrypted files that resisted her every attempt to open them, and file paths that led to dead ends. A deliberate digital obfuscation designed to bury the past forever. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, a testament to the corporation's ability to hide the truth in plain sight, drowning it in a sea of irrelevant data. There were moments of profound despair, where she felt she was chasing ghosts, that the evidence she sought had been permanently erased, scrubbed from existence by a more thorough, more paranoid generation of IT specialists. During these long, isolating nights, her father's memory was her only companion. She would recall his words from long ago, his frustrated explanations of the technical data he was trying to get his superiors to understand. He had spoken of pressure variance anomalies and gasket degradation rates. These phrases, once the arcane language of a beloved father, now became her search terms, her digital breadcrumbs. She would type them into the search fields, her heart aching with a renewed sense of connection to him, as if she were completing the work he had been forced to abandon. She was seeing the world through his eyes, fighting his battle with the tools of her own generation. Each failed search was a small death, but each new lead was a jolt of life, a sign that she was getting closer, that the truth was still there, waiting to be found, dormant but not dead. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m, in the dead silence of the library, surrounded by the sleeping ghosts of legal scholars. It was not a single dramatic document, but a chain of seemingly innocuous emails between Arthur Sterling's father, the then CEO, and the company's chief legal counsel. The subject line was simply the Havenwood variable. Buried within the dense corporate jargon was a cold, calculated strategy. They discussed mitigating the Vance narrative and decredentialing the source. One email, sent just days before the spill, contained the chilling phrase that made Ilara's blood run cold. Proceed with the containment protocol. The merger's valuation is paramount. We will absorb the fallout and isolate the engineer's claims. It was there, in black and white. A premeditated conspiracy to ignore her father's warnings, sacrifice a community's safety, and then systematically destroy his reputation to protect a stock price. She stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears finally, unstoppably, streamed down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of a terrible, vindicating rage. This was it. This was the proof. This was the weapon that could not be dismissed. The truth that could not be spun. She felt a profound sense of connection to her father in that moment, as if his long, silenced voice were finally speaking through her. She copied the files onto a secure, encrypted hard drive, her movements precise and deliberate. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion for weeks evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, focused energy. She had the evidence. She had the truth. But she knew that possessing the truth and deploying it effectively were two entirely different things. A leak could be dismissed as a forgery. She needed more than just evidence. She needed an unimpeachable platform. While Ilara was unearthing the past, Arthur Sterling was trying to bury it. The confrontation at Aura had shaken him to his core, awakening a dormant sense of guilt that his wealth could not soothe. He had launched a quiet, internal investigation of his own, framed as a, quote, digital security upgrade. His teams of corporate lawyers and IT experts began a systematic review of the deep archives, their official purpose to identify and eliminate security vulnerabilities. But their true purpose was to find and permanently erase any and all records related to the Havenwood spill and David Vance. It was a race Alara didn't even know she was in. A warning came in the form of a single, cryptic text message from an untraceable number, clearly from Marcus Thorne. "The librarians are burning the books. Soon." The message sent a jolt of pure panic through her. Her window of opportunity was closing, and it was closing fast. Armed with her irrefutable evidence and a ticking clock, Alara and Professor Finch made their final strategic decision. They couldn't take this to a regulatory agency, which could be slow-walked or influenced by Sterling Vanguard's army of lobbyists. They couldn't take it to a standard news outlet, which might bow to legal pressure. They needed a cannon, not a rifle. They needed someone who was immune to intimidation. A journalist with a reputation for toppling giants. There was only one name on that list: Julian Croft, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter whose television program, The Crucible, was the most feared and respected venue for corporate whistleblowers in the country. Securing a meeting with him was nearly impossible, but Professor Finch, using a lifetime of academic connections, managed to get Alara 30 minutes of his time. The meeting took place in a stark, minimalist office that felt more like an interrogation room than a news bureau. Julian Croft was a man whose skepticism was his primary shield, his eyes sharp and analytical, his demeanor radiating an intense, impatient intelligence. He listened to Alara's story with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. He had heard 1,000 stories of corporate malfeasance, of conspiracies and cover-ups. He was a professional dealer in outrage, and he was not easily impressed. Alara felt her confidence waver under his intense, dispassionate scrutiny. He was not an ally, he was a gatekeeper, and she had to prove her story was worthy of his attention. She took a deep breath, pushed the encrypted hard drive across the polished steel desk, and looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't just a story about a cover-up, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice resonating with the unshakable conviction of someone who had lived the consequences. "This is the complete anatomy of a corporate crime, from the initial decision to sacrifice safety for profit, to the deliberate destruction of a good man's life to hide the truth. The evidence on that drive doesn't just implicate the men who did it, it implicates the son who inherited their kingdom and chose to let the lies stand." She laid out the key emails, the suppressed reports, the direct link between Arthur Sterling's father and the current corporate structure. She wasn't just presenting facts, she was weaving a narrative of human cost, of a family destroyed, of a justice that had been denied for a decade. She was handing him not just a story, but a verdict, waiting to be delivered to the world. Julian Croft plugged the drive into his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. As he read the emails, the ones that spoke of isolating the Vance variable and prioritizing the merger, the mask of skepticism began to crack. A flicker of something new appeared in his eyes, the predatory gleam of a hunter who has just caught the scent of his prey. He looked up from the screen, no longer at Alara the petitioner, but at Alara the source, the key. The 30-minute meeting stretched into an hour, then 2. The gatekeeper was gone, replaced by an ally, a powerful validator who recognized the explosive power of the truth she had uncovered. He leaned forward, the full force of his professional focus now locked onto her. The plan began to form between them, a coordinated assault of media exposure and legal filings that would hit Sterling Vanguard with the force of a perfectly executed blitz. The stage for the final confrontation was now set. Alara left his office and walked out into the evening light, feeling the weight of the past 10 years beginning, finally, to lift. The checkmate was in sight. The annual Sterling Vanguard Philanthropy Gala was the apex of corporate hypocrisy, a self-congratulatory spectacle held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. The air was thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, a fragrant mask for the moral decay that festered beneath the surface of this glittering world. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, cast a brilliant, unforgiving light on the assembled titans of industry, their wives draped in jewels that could fund small nations. They mingled on plush crimson carpets, their laughter echoing off the gilded frescoed ceiling as they celebrated their own generosity, a performance of compassion funded by the very profits they had wrung from a world they held in contempt. On the grand stage, framed by enormous banners bearing the Sterling Vanguard logo, a single podium stood waiting. Tonight's keynote speaker was Arthur Sterling himself, and a palpable sense of anticipation filled the room. He had been a recluse since the incident at Aura weeks ago, and the corporate world was buzzing with rumors. In the sea of black tie attire, Ilara Vance was an island of quiet, intense focus. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, a garment that was a world away from her waitress uniform. But it was not the dress that transformed her. It was the absolute certainty in her eyes, the calm, unshakable power in her posture. She sat beside Julian Croft, not as a source or a victim, but as a partner in the coming storm, a silent executioner waiting for the signal to be given. Just as Arthur Sterling, looking gaunt and haunted, stepped onto the stage and approached the podium, the ballroom was plunged into a sudden, disorienting darkness. A collective gasp swept through the audience, followed by a nervous, tittering laughter that quickly died in their throats. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which moments before had been displaying a self-aggrandizing video loop of the company's charitable works, flickered to life. But instead of the corporate logo, they displayed the stark, uncompromising face of Julian Croft. His voice, amplified by the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, boomed through the cavernous space, a voice of calm, journalistic authority that was utterly alien to this environment of curated pleasantries. He announced a special, unscheduled live broadcast of The Crucible, his words cutting through the confusion like a scalpel. Panic, cold and immediate, began to ripple through the front rows. Where the Sterling Vanguard board of directors sat, they were trapped, their faces illuminated by the screens, their private celebration hijacked and turned into a public trial. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The doors had been metaphorically locked, and the most powerful people in the room were now a captive audience for the sins of their past. The broadcast began with the surgical precision of a master prosecutor laying out his case. Julian Croft did not start with spreadsheets or corporate filings. He started with a photograph. It was a black and white image of a young David Vance, his arm around his wife Eleanor, their faces radiating a warmth and intelligence that felt like a rebuke to the cold opulence of the room. From there, the narrative unfolded, a devastating tapestry woven from the evidence Ilara had painstakingly unearthed. The internal memos appeared on the screen, their cold, corporate jargon translated into the simple, brutal language of human greed. The suppressed safety reports, the frantic warnings about gasket degradation, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. Then came the emails, the digital smoking gun, with Arthur's father's name clearly visible in the sender field. Croft read the key phrases aloud, his voice dripping with righteous contempt. Mitigating the Vance narrative, decredentialing the source, proceed with the containment protocol. The camera, controlled by Croft's remote team, panned slowly across the faces of the board members, catching their frozen smiles, their desperate, darting eyes, their pathetic attempts to appear unconcerned as their world collapsed around them in real time. The evidence was not just damning, it was absolute. The report then pivoted from the crime to its consequences, transforming the abstract data into an unbearable human cost. The screens showed harrowing images of the Havenwood chemical spill's aftermath, the blighted landscape, the grieving families, the headlines that had branded David Vance a villain. Then the imagery shifted to a quiet, recently filmed video. It showed David Vance in his sterile room at the care facility, The camera simply held on him as he struggled for nearly a minute with the simple, heartbreaking task of lifting a glass of water to his lips, his hand trembling with a palsy that was a direct result of the stroke his public crucifixion had induced. The profound, silent suffering in that room stood in such stark, violent contrast to the glittering excess of the gala that it felt like a physical blow. The camera then cut to a live feed of Alara sitting in the audience. She did not speak. She simply met the camera's gaze, her eyes holding a decade of grief, resilience, and now a terrible final judgment. Her silent, unwavering stare was more powerful than any testimony, a living testament to the human wreckage left in the wake of Sterling Vanguard's ambition. She was the ghost at their feast, the face of the truth they had tried to bury. All eyes in the ballroom, and now around the world, turned to the man on the stage. Arthur Sterling stood alone in a single, harsh spotlight, trapped between the ghosts on the screen and the horrified faces of his peers. The weight of his father's sins, a legacy he had accepted without question, now descended upon him with a crushing, absolute force. The entire edifice of his life, his wealth, his power, his cynicism, had been built on this single, foundational crime. The audience waited for the inevitable denial, the practiced, empty words of a PR statement read from a teleprompter. But the man who approached the podium was not the cynical CEO who had entered the room. He was a man who had been broken open, first by an act of kindness in a restaurant, and now by the public revelation of his family's cruelty. He waved away his frantic legal team and leaned into the microphone. His voice when he spoke was not the voice of a titan of industry, but the raw, fractured voice of a man confessing his soul. He did not deny the charges. He confirmed every last one. He spoke of his own complicity, his willful blindness, and then, looking directly into the camera that held Alara's face, he apologized. It was a complete, unconditional surrender to the truth, a public dismantling of a lifetime of lies, an act of self-immolation that was also, impossibly, the first step toward grace. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Arthur Sterling finally exposed the truth. The fallout from Arthur Sterling's public confession was swift and merciless. It was a corporate apocalypse. The next morning, Sterling Vanguard stock didn't just fall, it ceased to exist, frozen by regulators pending a full-scale federal investigation. The board members who had been squirming in the front row were stripped of their titles, their golden parachutes incinerated by the heat of the scandal. They were pariahs, their names synonymous with a level of corporate malfeasance that shocked even the jaded sensibilities of Wall Street. But Arthur Sterling did not use his remaining influence to fight the inevitable. He fueled it. He turned over every server, every document, every last shred of evidence to the Department of Justice, becoming the chief witness against his own company's past. He didn't just accept the consequences, he architected them. With cold, methodical precision, he dismantled his father's empire of lies. He publicly and formally exonerated David Vance, issuing a global press release that restored his name and detailed his heroic attempts to prevent the disaster. He then established a $5 billion restitution fund for the victims of Havenwood and their families, a sum that dwarfed any corporate settlement in history, funded by the liquidation of his own personal assets. It was a radical, unprecedented act of corporate penance, a sign that the cynical king was truly dead and that something new, something better, was struggling to be born from the ashes. 1 year later, the city's skyline looked different to Alara Vance. She viewed it not from the service entrance of a restaurant, but from the floor-to-ceiling windows of a corner office. The lettering on the glass door read, "The Vance Foundation for Corporate Ethics and Victim Advocacy." She was its founder and director, armed with a multi-billion-dollar endowment from Arthur Sterling and a singular, unshakable mission, to ensure that no other family would ever have to endure what hers had. She had become a force of nature in the legal world, a fierce, brilliant advocate for the powerless dismantling corporate corruption, with the same precision and focus she had once used to clear tables. Her work had already led to the passage of landmark new whistleblower protection legislation, aptly nicknamed Vance's Law. In the final scene, she is not in her office or in a courtroom. She is sitting by her father's bedside in a sun-drenched room at the finest neurological care facility in the country. He is calmer now, the lines of stress on his face softened. He cannot speak in sentences, but his eyes are clear. On the blanket covering his lap lies a copy of the New York Times, the headlines celebrating the passage of his namesake law. He looks from the newspaper to his daughter, and after a moment of intense, focused effort, a slow, beautiful smile spreads across his face. It is a smile of pure, boundless pride. Alara takes his hand, her fight not over, but her victory, and his, finally, completely won. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.